They call themselves the House of Israel. For centuries, in the mountain villages of the Ethiopian highlands, they kept the Sabbath, observed dietary laws, and prayed in an ancient language while the rest of the world either forgot they existed or refused to believe they were real. They were Ethiopian. They were Jewish. And when Israeli planes finally airlifted tens of thousands of them out of Africa in the 1980s and the 1990s, in operations so dramatic they still feel cinematic, it looked like the end of a 2,000-year exile, a homecoming, a lost tribe finally returned. But ask the scientists what the DNA actually shows, and the story immediately becomes more complicated. The Beta Israel, that is their name for themselves, meaning House of Israel, are one of the most debated communities in the history of genetics and religion. Three competing theories explain their origins. Scholars have argued over them for decades. And the ancient DNA, when it finally arrived, did not settle the argument. It transformed it. To understand what the science is saying, you first need to understand the landscape that shaped this community. Ethiopia is not one flat country. It is a world of geological drama, the Great Rift Valley carving the land in two, the Semien Mountains rising to nearly 15,000 feet, the Blue Nile cutting through gorges so deep they create natural walls between populations. Lake Tana sits in the northwest highlands like a mirror for the sky. For most of history, the people who lived in these mountains stayed in them. The highlands were not just beautiful, they were a fortress. This is where the Beta Israel lived, in over 500 small, dispersed villages scattered across the northwest highlands of what are now the Gondor and Tigray regions, clustered around Lake Tana and the Semien Ridge. They were never one unified block. There was no single capital, no single religious authority, no common written tradition they created themselves. They lived among Christian and Muslim populations, distinct from their neighbors by religion, yet woven into the same highland fabric by language, trade, and ancestry. And that is where the first complication appears. When we say Ethiopian Jews, we are already combining four separate things that do not always align: a religion, a nationality, a community name, and a genetic ancestry. These four things point in different directions. The religion is Jewish, but it is not the Judaism most of the world practices. My nationality is Ethiopian. The community name is Beta Israel. And the genetic ancestry, as study after study has now confirmed, clusters overwhelmingly with other Ethiopians. Their Judaism is old, strikingly old. Beta Israel never used the Talmud. They had no knowledge of Hanukkah. They did not read from a Hebrew Torah scroll in the standard rabbinic tradition. Their sacred language was Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic tongue that became the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Their religious canon was the Old Testament and a set of additional ancient texts. This form of Judaism looks like it was preserved from a time before the destruction of the Second Temple, before Rabbinic Judaism crystallized the tradition that most Jewish communities follow today. That is not a coincidence. That is a clue about when this community formed and where its religious roots came from. The first is the most famous. The community descends from Menelik I, the legendary son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, who is said to have brought the Ark of the Covenant from Jerusalem to Ethiopia and founded the Solomonic dynasty. The second is that they descend from the lost tribe of Dan, soldiers who accompanied Menelik from Jerusalem as a royal guard. The third is more diffy Jewish traders, refugees, or missionaries moved south from Egypt through Arabia or Sudan and eventually entered the Ethiopian highlands, where they converted portions of the local population and built a Jewish community over centuries. These are not identical claims, and the DNA treats them very differently. Here is what genetics actually shows. The dominant paternal lineage among Beta Israel men, carried by roughly 40%, is haplogroup A. A haplogroup, in simple terms, is a marker carried by one paternal line, passed from father to son across generations. Haplogroup A is not a Middle Eastern signal. It is one of the oldest branches on the human Y chromosome tree. The specific variant found in Ethiopian Jews traces back to the Ethiopian highlands and has roots extending back approximately 10,000 years. This is ancient Africa. There is no route from Jerusalem that produces this result. Another haplogroup, EM329, found in roughly 18% of Beta Israel men, was also identified in ancient DNA extracted from a 4,500-year-old Ethiopian burial, not a migration marker, not a recent arrival. Evidence of a population that has been in the Ethiopian highlands for thousands of years before any Israelite kingdom existed. The maternal lines tell a similar story. A study examining mitochondrial DNA, the genetic signature inherited through the mother, found that over half of Beta Israel maternal ancestry belongs to macro haplogroup L. This lineage is typical of sub-Saharan and Northeast African populations. The remaining maternal lines are Eurasian in origin, present but in the minority. Most strikingly, when researchers compared Beta Israel maternal haplotypes with those of Yemenite Jewish women, they found no identical matches. None. If the two communities had shared a significant recent common ancestry through the Arabian Peninsula, that signal would be there. It is not. The broader picture comes from autosomal DNA, the kind inherited from both parents across many ancestral lines, giving researchers a sense of overall genetic mixture rather than just one paternal or maternal thread. A comprehensive study by Tishkoff and colleagues in 2009 examined the genetic affiliations of populations across Africa and found that the Beta Israel grouped consistently with other Cushitic and Ethio-Semitic speaking populations in the Horn of Africa. A genome-wide study in 2010 of Jewish populations by Behar and colleagues found that while Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Mizrahi's Jews share a strong autosomal relatedness to one another, consistent with shared ancient Levantine ancestry, the Beta Israel do not cluster with them. They cluster with the Amhara and the Tigrayans, their Christian highland neighbors. In other words, the genome-wide signal says this is an Ethiopian community, not a transplant from Israel, not a lost tribe preserved in genetic amber, a community whose deep ancestry is rooted in the African Horn. But the DNA does not close the door entirely on outside contact. And this is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating. Research published in the American Journal of Human Genetics identified gene flow into Ethiopia from populations genetically related to ancient Egyptians, Syrians, or Israelites occurring roughly 3,000 years ago. Professor Chris Tyler Smith from the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute noted at the time that this signal fits broadly with the era of the Queen of Sheba oral tradition. The timing is real. The gene flow is real. It simply did not replace the existing population, it joined it. To understand what probably happened, you need to look at the world that the Beta Israel were born into. The Aksumite Empire, one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world, flourished across what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea from roughly the 1st century to the 7th century CE. Aksum traded with Rome, Byzantium, Persia, and Arabia. Its language, Ge'ez, contains loanwords from Jewish Aramaic, a clear signal of cultural and linguistic contact with the ancient Levant. The Ge'ez Bible the Beta Israel used was translated from these early Septuagint texts, the Greek Old Testament, before the Talmud had been assembled, suggesting Jewish religious influence arrived early in the Aksumite period, or even before it. Even further back, the civilization of Kush, centered in what is now Sudan, predated Aksum by well over 1,000 years. Archaeological evidence shows sustained trade and cultural exchange between Kush and the Horn of Africa. It is entirely plausible, and increasingly supported by scholars, that Jewish or Judaizing communities entered Ethiopia not directly from the Levant by sea, but through Egypt and the Nile Valley, moving south through Kush and into the highlands over many generations. What research now increasingly supports is not a simple transplant of Israelites into Ethiopia. It is a process. Small numbers of Jews or Jewish-influenced migrants, possibly through South Arabia, possibly through Egypt and Sudan, reached the Ethiopian highlands and, over centuries, converted portions of the local Agaw population to Judaism. The Agaw are a Cushitic-speaking highland people, indigenous to the northwest Ethiopian plateau, and they appear to be the probable genetic foundation of what eventually became the Beta Israel community. A 2012 study by Oster and colleagues estimated that the Beta Israel community, as a formal group, probably crystallized roughly 2,000 years ago, founded by a relatively small number of people, with significant local integration over the following centuries. This is the founder effect in action. A small founding group in an isolated highland environment leaves a strong community identity, even as the surrounding genetic population base grows through local incorporation. The religious identity consolidated. The genetic ancestry remained overwhelmingly African. The internal structure of the Beta Israel community reflects this complexity. They were never homogeneous. Across their over 500 dispersed villages, religious practice varied. Some subgroups show stronger connections to the Agal populations of the Northwest. Others show physical features more closely associated with populations from the Nile Valley and northern Sudan, consistent with the Kush corridor hypothesis. There was no single origin, no single migration, no single founding moment. The community is likely polygenetic, assembled from multiple sources over a long period of time. This internal variation also explains a dramatic figure in Ethiopian history who is almost always missing from popular accounts: Queen Judith. Around the 10th century, a warrior queen, associated in tradition with Beta Israel or allied Agal forces, is said to have conquered the Aksumite capital, burned churches and monasteries, and briefly imposed a non-Christian rule over the region. Her exact identity is disputed. The historical documentation is fragmentary, but her existence in oral tradition and medieval Ethiopian chronicles points to a period when the Beta Israel were not merely a marginal minority. They were a political force with territorial autonomy in the highland Northwest. That autonomy did not last. From the 14th century onward, Christian Ethiopian emperors pushed back. Beta Israel lands were confiscated. Forced conversions reduced the community's size. By the 17th century, when Emperor Susenyos completed the conquest of the Beta Israel territories, the community had been compressed into a smaller, more fragile remnant, a bottleneck that shaped the genetic and cultural profile that researchers study today. Much of the earlier regional variation collapsed. What survived was more concentrated, more isolated, and paradoxically more distinctive. So, what does science ultimately say about who the Beta Israel actually are? They are not genetically descended from the ancient Israelites in any straightforward sense. The autosomal DNA, the maternal DNA, and the dominant paternal lineages all point to an ancestry that is deeply and primarily African, rooted in the ancient Horn of Africa for thousands of years before the emergence of any Israelite kingdom. The DNA does not support the lost tribe narrative. It does not trace a straight line from Jerusalem to Lake Tana, but it does support contact. Some Levantine gene flow reached Ethiopia around 3,000 years ago. Something moved between the ancient Near East and the Ethiopian highlands during the era of the Aksumite Empire, and before it, through trade routes, through Kush, through South Arabia. Whether those contacts were the original seeds of Jewish religion in Ethiopia, or whether they represent something earlier and broader, the scholars are still working out. The picture, as researchers frequently note, is still being refined. What science does establish is something more layered and more interesting than any single myth allows. The Beta Israel are a community whose religious identity crystallized through ancient contact with Judaism, probably via small founding groups of Jews or Jewish-influenced migrants arriving through Sudan and Arabia, converting portions of the local Agal population and creating something new. They preserved a form of pre-rabbinic Jewish practice that had already become extinct everywhere else in the world. They did it across mountains, across centuries of persecution, across political conquests that stripped their land and compressed their numbers. And they did it without losing what made them Ethiopian. Their genetics are African, their prayers are ancient, their identity is both. This is the point where simple origin myths always fail. The DNA does not prove they came from Israel, but it does not make them less Jewish. It reveals something the myth was never designed to show, that identity does not require a pure bloodline to be real. It requires survival. It requires the decision, generation after generation, to keep something alive. Beta Israel made that decision across 2,000 years of highland isolation, political pressure, and cultural weight that most communities would not have survived. When the planes flew them to Israel in the 1980s and the 1990s, that journey was real. The identity they carried was real. The ancestry beneath it was ancient, African, layered, and far more complex than the word homecoming implies. The genetic archive of Beta Israel is not the story of a lost tribe found. It is the story of something more human, a community that built itself from the ground of an ancient land, absorbed a religion from across a trade route, preserved it without instruction or support, and emerged from the mountains still intact. Their DNA says Africa. Their prayers say something much older than any modern nation. And somehow, against all probability, both things are true at once.